introductions to a research paper. This is a paper about Portuguese literature that was hoped to be published sometime in a journal, a literature journal. And we want to talk specifically again about the introduction to the paper. And there's no one template here that you can use. So I'm just going to look at some of the strategies that the author here is using in the first few paragraphs of his paper, and just to get a general sense of what goes into an introduction. So if you look here at the first sentence, it's very packed with information. He introduces the subject of the paper, the Portuguese translation of the biblical verses that the former converso, and then the name of the author that he's discussing, Uriel da Costa, gives the years that he lived, and then what his where the title of the work that he's looking at, and then the reason for the paper, which is that this research has not received enough attention. And so that's his motivation for writing this paper, not received enough attention. In the second sentence, he begins by talking about the reason why it may not have been given enough attention. Few scholars have been able to combine a good proficiency in 17th century Portuguese and biblical Hebrew. So this is what we usually call a gap in the research. And it's interesting, it's a gap on the part of the people who do the research, and in part because the book just hasn't been available until the last 20 years. And that's a fairly long time, but in literature, evidently, that doesn't seem to make much difference. So there are two reasons here for the gap, and assuming he's going to be able to fill this gap, in the third sentence here, he says he wants to demonstrate that da Costa's Portuguese reflects the liminal character of his identity. And again, he doesn't totally explain that, but that's what the goal of this paper is. And then in the next little piece of text, he continues to give background information to the publication of the book which he's discussing. And so that it was published in Amsterdam in 1624. It reflects the vernacular Portuguese of the time. And he goes on to point out there's both modern and archaic Portuguese features in the text. And I also want to point out how the author here uses footnotes in a number of different ways. I mean, footnote number 1 gives the original Portuguese title, which he seems to be assuming that the audience is primarily an English-speaking audience, but he still has to give the original title. He gives in footnote number 2 some historical background of the paper. Now, this may or may not be directly relevant to his topic, but it provides a little background of this paper and some citations about what has already been published about the paper. And again, he doesn't integrate that into the body of the text, but rather he gives it as a footnote. Footnote number 3 is a quote from a critic, and again, he uses this longer quote here really to support and explain what he's talking about with the word liminality, which he used in the part of his paper where he's going to show how he's going to fill the gap in the research. Here he explains exactly some background to that, which again he seems to feel it wasn't necessary or was too much detail to be put into the body of the paper. And footnote number 4 gives a citation in a very traditional way, but he doesn't integrate it into the text, and this supports his claim and to give more background to what he's talking about. In the next paragraph, he continues to give more background information, talking about the translation process, and that the result he describes as a little bit awkward. But again, he follows, but then he argues at the end, and I guess this will be part of his argument, that the translator of the Hebrew Bible follows the tradition of changing it as little as possible. So that there's a connection here between the biblical process of translation and the process that this author uses. The next paragraph goes on to try to explain the motivation of the author. Now again, he doesn't know the motivation of the author, so he has to hedge this claim a lot. And so why isn't the Hebrew in the Bible the original translation? And he gives his possible explanation that these were Portuguese New Christians and were not familiar with the Hebrew language. And he may not, goes on another reason to explain, he may not have been himself familiar with Hebrew, so he could not have accessed the language because it was forbidden in Portugal. So this, he gives again background as to how the translation that the author uses in his work.